A wheat field in Norfolk, present day. Beneath the crop, faint and cracked, a strip of concrete runs in a perfectly straight line for nearly a mile, visible only from the air or in the low light of early morning, when shadows catch the seams between slabs. A control tower stands alone at the field's edge, windows broken, roof half collapsed, ivy climbing its brick corners. Nothing marks it. No sign explains it. 80 years ago, this quiet stretch of English farmland was RAF Fersfield, a fully operational bomber station from which mosquitoes launched one of the war's most secretive raids, a strike on Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen. Within a year of victory, it was sold, stripped, and quietly handed back to agriculture. This was not an isolated case. It was the fate of hundreds of stations across Britain, and dismantling them proved almost as vast an undertaking as building them had been. This is not where the bombing campaign ends. It is where the infrastructure that made it possible disappears. The scale of what had been built defies easy comprehension. By 1945, the county of Lincolnshire alone, known to its residents simply as Bomber County, hosted 49 operational airfields. Avro Lancasters based at roughly half of them, their runways and dispersal pans covering a landscape that had been open farmland just 5 years before. Across East Anglia, the pattern repeated at a scale historians still struggle to convey. Hundreds of concrete runways, thousands of Nissen huts, control towers, bomb stores and fuel depots, imposed onto a rural county whose fields had previously grown wheat and sugar beet, not four-engined bombers. Each station had consumed hundreds of acres of requisitioned farmland under wartime emergency powers, land whose owners had, in many cases, been given only weeks to leave. With victory secured, the Air Ministry faced a problem inverse to the one it had solved in 1940, not how to build an air force at unprecedented speed, but how to dismantle one almost as quickly, while a nation desperate for food production waited for its fields back. The legal machinery moved first. The Requisitioned Land and War Works Act of 1945, followed by a further act in 1948, established the framework under which land taken for military use could be formally released, its owners compensated, and its condition assessed for restoration. In practice, derequisitioning proved far slower and more contentious than the legislation implied. In a House of Lords debate on agriculture, in December 1947, one peer, speaking for landowners in East Anglia, complained bitterly that his region contained what he called an immense area sterilized by unused airfields, land nominally returned to local agricultural committees for cultivation, but held under tenancies so short, often just a single year, that no farmer could justify investing in it. The bureaucracy of handing land back, it turned out, was almost as slow as the bureaucracy that had taken it. On the ground, the process of closure varied enormously from station to station, and this is where the macro-level policy dissolves into the granular, often improvised reality of individual airfields. At RAF Glatton in Huntingdonshire, the station remained in limited RAF use into 1948, its runways still supporting Bomber Command Lancasters and Liberators flying logistics routes to the Middle East, before finally closing and being sold. Only fragments of 2 runways were retained. The rest returned, slab by slab, to agriculture. At RAF Sudbury in Suffolk, closure came almost immediately in 1945, a brief post-war life as a recruit training centre, and then abandonment. The site gradually reclaimed by vegetation or dug over for crops, with piles of broken concrete simply dumped at the field's margins, because removing them entirely cost more than leaving them. Not every airfield followed the same path into obscurity. At RAF Grove in Oxfordshire, the closure process took a stranger turn. Returned to the RAF in 1946, the station's runways found a second post-war life as a surplus aircraft disposal ground. Rows of redundant fighters and bombers awaiting scrapping lined up where bomber crews had once briefed for raids over Germany. By 1955, in one of the more improbable transformations of the entire disposal program, part of the airfield had been absorbed by the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority to support the nearby Harwell research establishment, the physical infrastructure of Bomber Command quietly repurposed for Britain's nuclear research program. The friction in all of this rarely appears in official records, but it shaped daily life at dozens of sites simultaneously. Farmers negotiating one-year tenancies could not justify the investment needed to properly return heavily compacted runway subsoil to productive cultivation. Local councils, eager to reclaim land for housing in a country facing an acute post-war shortage, found themselves competing with the Air Ministry's own reluctance to release sites it suspected might be needed again. Demolition contractors paid to clear concrete and steel discovered that removing a runway was often barely more economical than leaving it, and thousands of acres of hardstanding across the country were simply abandoned in place rather than dug up, silently persisting under decades of subsequent tenant farming. By 1950, a new and unexpected force intervened to reverse the pattern entirely. Rising Cold War tensions and the recognition that a new generation of jet-powered fighters and bombers required longer runways and hardened facilities meant that a portion of the airfields marked for abandonment were instead redeveloped, expanded, and absorbed into a new national defense network, this time built for confrontation with the Soviet Union rather than Nazi Germany. The stations selected for retention received extended concrete runways, blast walls, and eventually, through the 1970s and 1980s, hardened aircraft shelters designed to withstand attack. The stations not selected continued their slower disappearance, returned in full to farmland forestry, or in a number of cases near expanding towns, absorbed into post-war housing estates, whose street patterns, viewed from above, still trace the geometry of a wartime perimeter track. The human dimension of this transition rarely survives in the historical record with the same clarity as the concrete itself. Communities that had hosted thousands of aircrew, many of them young men from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, watched the huts empty and the runway lights go dark within months of the war's end. Village halls that had served as impromptu social centers for base personnel returned to purely local use. Pubs that had filled nightly with aircrew before missions returned to their pre-war rhythms. The physical apparatus of an air offensive that had, by war's end, flown over 500,000 operational sorties and dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs across occupied Europe, dissolved back into the quiet agricultural landscape it had been carved from, in most cases within a decade. Today, the survival of these sites is deeply uneven. A small number at Woodhall Spa and elsewhere have become the sites of memorials and small heritage centres, maintained by local aviation history societies rather than any national preservation programme. A handful of control towers survive as farm buildings or private residences, their operations rooms converted to storage for machinery rather than mission briefings. The great majority, however, left no trace beyond the occasional straight line visible in a satellite photograph, or the faint discoloration in a crop where compacted runway foundations still restrict root growth 70 years after the E. Concrete above them was carted, away debriefing assessed as an infrastructure and land management problem rather than a military campaign. The post-war dismantling of Britain's bomber airfields reveals three defining pressures and one lasting irony. First, the sheer scale of wartime construction. Hundreds of stations built at emergency speed across East Anglia and Lincolnshire alone meant that closure could never be treated as a single administrative act. It became instead hundreds of separate local negotiations between the Air Ministry, local landowners and agricultural committees, each proceeding at its own pace and producing wildly inconsistent outcomes. Second, the legal and bureaucratic machinery of derequisitioning, embodied in the 1945 and 1948 War Works Acts, consistently lagged behind the urgency of Britain's post-war food production needs, leaving farmers holding short, insecure tenancies on land they had every reason to distrust as a long-term investment. Third, economic reality dictated outcomes as much as policy did. Where removing concrete cost more than leaving it, concrete stayed, a pattern visible today in the thousands of acres of abandoned hardstanding still scattered across the English countryside. The lasting irony is geographic as much as historical. The very same emergency logic that identified flat, well-drained East Anglian farmland as ideal for wartime runway construction in 1940 made that land, once returned, ideally suited to the intensive agriculture that would define the region for the rest of the 20th century, meaning the fields that had launched bombers over the Reich became, within a single generation, some of the most productive wheat-growing land in Britain.